thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I actually think, before I start, I'd just like to remember Catherine Colby, because Catherine invited me to be part of this lecture series. It would be a year ago, March. So I'm grateful for the invitation I received from Catherine. I'm grateful to all who are here who were able to follow up on it. And I have no doubt that Catherine's spirit is with us this evening as we explore a rather dense topic for the evening. But we'll do the best that we can. As I'm sure some of you may know, during the season of Advent last year, the Dominican family celebrated the 500th anniversary of a homily preached by Friar Antonio Montesinos in the name of his Dominican community, upholding the rights of the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola. And the image on the screen right now is an image of Antonio Montesinos. There's a massive statue in the harbor in Santo Domingo. So that's the image of Montesinos and some of the words from the homily he preached. The indigenous peoples of Hispaniola were slaves of the Spanish conquistadores and of the clergy as well, and they were treated as less than human. The words of the homily were harsh and blunt, and I'd like to share some of those words with you now. Montesinos preached, "By what right or interpretation of justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these peoples who have lived mildly and peacefully in their own lands? Why do you so greatly oppress and fatigue them? Are they not human? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? How can you lay in such profound and lethargic slumber?" Present in the congregation on that Advent Sunday in 1511 was Bartolomé de las Casas, whose own status as a gentleman cleric was deeply challenged by this preaching. While it took Las Casas several more years and additional witnessing of the abuses and the atrocities of the encomienda system of slavery and forced labor, he experienced a profound inner conversion. And in 1514, Las Casas renounced his ownership of slaves and his participation in the system of forced labor, and began to preach his own sermons, provocative sermons, against the wrongs of the Spanish conquest. Las Casas later wrote that the blinders fell from his eyes, and he saw that everything the Spaniards had done in the Indies from the beginning had been completely wrong. In 1522, Las Casas entered the Dominican order, and his spirit and the spirit of Antonio Montesinos continue to inspire countless numbers of Dominican men and women throughout the world who advocate on behalf of the human rights of all peoples. The title of this presentation is Eradicating Poverty. What is our role? I won't presume to answer that question clearly, because there are probably as many answers to that question as there are people in this room. What actions are we willing to take? What questions are we willing to ask? Or do we have so much invested in the way things are that silence and inaction seem like the better course for us to take? However, in terms of an inner disposition or a perspective that we can bring to this issue, perhaps the story of Las Casas will provide us with an insight. He had a great deal invested in the way things were. So silence and inaction were the better course for him for a good long time. But something happened. The world is an hostile and an inhospitable place for the vast majority of our brothers and sisters. And the one fragile home we share with them, our planet Earth, is in great peril. But in some way, people like you and like me are called, just like those first Dominicans on the island of Hispaniola, to be part of a process that ushers in a new reign of God, where all peoples are able to enjoy something of the fullness of life that God so dearly desires for them, and a time when earth will once again flourish. Now, there are some of you in this room who probably were not born when that photograph was taken. It was taken in the year 1968. Does anybody know the title of that picture? Pardon? Earthrise. And it was taken by the astronauts on Apollo 8, which was the first manned voyage to the moon. It's considered to be the most influential environmental photograph ever taken and marked the beginning of the environmental movement worldwide. The astronauts who participated on the various Apollo flights, astronauts from many different countries of the world, all commented on what they saw, in that they saw no barriers. They saw oneness and a unity. It was a very holy, profound experience for these men. The Passionist priest Thomas Berry, who passed away in 2009, understood very well that with the degradation of nature comes the diminishment of the human. And Thomas Berry said, the natural world is the larger sacred community to which we all belong. To be alienated from this community is to become destitute in all that makes us human. But the reality of our world today, in more ways than not, is characterized by what we call globalization. It's not necessarily characterized by that sense of oneness and unity that was the experience of those Apollo astronauts. The reality of globalization has done marvelous things for many people. For many people, but not for all people. The 2007 report from the International Monetary Fund recognized the close connection between an inadequately managed process of globalization and the world's great inequities. The image on the screen of a gun with a twisted barrel is on the plaza outside the United Nations in New York. So if you've been to New York, you may have remembered seeing that. I think it's a powerful image. If the barrel of a gun is twisted, what happens? It's useless, you know. And don't we all long for that day, you know, when the barrels of guns are twisted, when nuclear warheads are silenced, and peace will reign for all of God's people. When I look at that image, though, I say to myself, this is the problem with our world today. Our priorities are twisted. And because our priorities are twisted, the vast majority of God's people do not have access to what they need to enjoy something of what it means to be fully human here and now. So I think part of our role, if you will, is to do whatever we can to untwist those priorities, not in any grand and glorious way, but right here where we are, in whatever way we feel moved to do that. In the Dominican order, we have three overarching areas that we consider to be our priorities, or our themes, if you will, in terms of justice and peace worldwide. Very simply, peace and security, peoples on the move or migration, and economic justice and care of the earth. So everything that I do at the United Nations in New York, everything that my colleague, my counterpart, Olivier Poquillon, Dominican friar in Geneva at the United Nations, everything that we do is in some way incorporated under those three thematic areas, and everything that we do has the underpinning of advocacy on behalf of human rights for all people. So what I'd like to do now, since the theme is eradication of poverty, is to offer you a very brief thumbnail sketch of the reality of the world in which we live. Not to overwhelm you with statistics, but just to lift up what is the reality. Nearly half of the world's 7 billion people today live in poverty. And over 1 billion of those people live on less than $1.25 a day, which is the benchmark that the World Bank provides. $1.25 a day. At the United Nations, however, there's a movement to be cognizant of the fact that poverty is not just a lack of income, it's not just a lack of money, it's lack of access. It's lack of access to food, lack of access to water, clean water, sanitation, health care, employment, education. So poverty is not just a money issue, it's an access issue. And another important piece in terms of access is participation. If people don't have what they need to live a decent life, they're not equipped to participate in the decision-making processes that have such a tremendous impact on their lives. 900 million people worldwide cannot read or write, and the vast majority of those 9 million are women and children, particularly girls. 1.3 billion human beings cannot access clean water. I met with 2 classes this morning and mentioned this to one of the classes, so this will be repetitious for some of you. But in July of 2010, the government of Bolivia brought a resolution before the General Assembly asking that clean water and proper sanitation be designated as human rights. The resolution passed, but there were 46 abstentions. 2 of the abstentions were the United States and Canada. Why would that be? Well, the United States and Canada, along with other nations of the world, are heavily involved in mining and other heavy industry in many countries in Africa, Latin America, South America. And a byproduct of that activity is the horrific pollution and the depletion of local water supplies. So if, in fact, water and sanitation were ever codified as a human right in a convention or a treaty, that means a country could be brought to the International Court of Justice and held accountable for violating the right. So countries who are actively engaged in pollution are not going to go along with that. Right? But to say that water isn't a human right, it's like mom and apple pie. It's hard to imagine. It's really hard to fathom. You can't survive without clean water. And it's becoming more and more of a difficulty for people in the developing world. 1 out of every 5 children born dies before his or her 5th birthday. And if a child, this has primarily due to malnutrition, if malnutrition is not reversed in a child by the age of 5, the child suffers irreparable damage, physically, intellectually, emotionally. So you could have 2 10-year-olds in a school. If one child was terribly malnourished growing up between those pivotal years of 1 to 5, that child will never be on a par with the child who received relatively adequate nutrition. So there are generations upon generations of children who in some way are being doomed to a non-productive life. Half the forests that originally covered the Earth's surface are gone, and deforestation is a contributing factor to climate change. And global warming, it's expected to increase the temperature of the globe in the next 100 years with many adverse effects, not just to the human population, but to Earth herself and her ecosystems. The phenomena of migration today. In 2010, the estimates were 214 million people on the move. 19 million more than just 4 years previous, 2005. Half of those peoples on the move are females. And for females, I'm sure you realize there are added risks. There's the risk of rape. There's the risk of HIV/AIDS. 27.1 million people are internally displaced. And we had internal displacement right here in the United States after Hurricane Katrina. So this is not a phenomenon that just happens in the developing world. It happened right here. Internal displacement. 15.2 million refugees throughout the world with nowhere to go. The phenomena of forced migration. These people aren't choosing to move, they have to move. And some of the reasons why they have to move have to do with conflict. And we've seen that in places like the Sudan. Development policies and projects. If a large industrial firm goes into an area where indigenous people live and decides they need to create a road to make transport of what they mine easier for the corporation, they just go in and do that. No consultation with local people at all. So those people are forced off their lands. And then disasters. The famine in Somalia sent many people into Kenya. They were displaced from their own country. They ended up in Kenya, which is the home of the largest refugee camp in the world. So people are forced, they're forced to move by phenomena that probably were, in terms of the environment and development policies, phenomena that did not exist years ago when we talked about the phenomena of migration. And then, of course, we have the issue of climate change, which is alive and well, although you will have people who refute it tooth and nail. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that the warming of the climate is unequivocal. It's evident from widespread melting of snow and of ice, of rising global air and ocean temperatures, and rising sea levels. There's consensus among climate scientists that temperature increases should be limited to 2 degrees centigrade to avoid irreversible damage to the planet. The main drivers of climate change are greenhouse gases, changes in land cover, which is deforestation, and changes in the intensity of solar radiation. The primary responses to climate change at this point in time are mitigation, which would mean doing whatever we can do to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, which means we acknowledge what's happening and we try to put systems in place to help increase our resilience. Just last week, there was an event at the United Nations, a workshop entitled Poverty and Climate Change, Lives in the Balance. Two sisters of Notre Dame de Namur from the Democratic Republic of Congo said that what was the ordinary 9-month rainy season, followed by 3 dry months, was always dependable. But they said now maybe there are 5 months of rain, and their harvesting has become unpredictable. The speaker from Kenya noted that the rains would arrive without fail on November 15th, but no more. And because of the unpredictability of the rains, there's unpredictability of harvests. The ambassador of the Maldives, which is a chain of over 1,000 coral islands in the Indian Ocean, said that rising sea levels due to climate change threaten the very existence of his nation. And since the Maldives are dependent upon imported food, as climate impacts food production and food prices begin to soar, the food security of the people of the Maldives will be compromised. Now, the slide on the screen is climate change in the South Pacific. I had the pleasure of a Dominican sister from New Zealand. She spent January through May of last year with me at the United Nations and spoke about the phenomena of climate change on the small islands in the South Pacific. In the South Pacific, around where the purple star is up there, those are the Solomon Islands. And there's a presence of Dominican sisters and priests on the Solomon Islands. But the Solomon Islands, like the island of Tuvalu, which is the red star, it's a matter of time for many of these islands. It's a question of time as to when the islands themselves will become inhabitable because they're in the process of becoming submerged. So you have climate change, which is forcing migration, which at the end of the day is going to increase the incidence of poverty worldwide. And that's just another little example of Tuvalu. It's a skinny little thing, you know. But 10,000 people live there. These are people. I think sometimes when we look at the news, we read the paper, and these things are happening in such faraway places, we say to ourselves, I can't do anything. I can't do anything to stop this. And there's an element of truth in that. But I think John Paul II has some wonderful words about how important it is, the importance of a disposition of solidarity is. And he says that solidarity, it's not just a vague feeling of sympathy for people who are suffering, whether they're in your own backyard or whether they're far away. Solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, a greater good than what might be good for me or the U.S. There is a greater good, a common good, a universal common good. That is to say, a commitment to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. Go back to that image of Earth. We share that tiny blue marble with everybody else. There's nowhere else to go. So I think we're at a juncture of history where we have to take greater ownership over our responsibility for the good of the whole. In the fall of last year, the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace issued a marvelous statement calling for the reform of the global economic system. And throughout that statement, probably about a dozen times, they refer to the common good, the public good, the universal common good. Now, this is a term that we don't really hear much in discourse at the United Nations. I'm not sure I'm hearing it now in the run-up to the elections in this country. But the Pontifical Council says this, and I think this is a challenge for people like you and me, and it might indicate to us what one of our roles might be in terms of dealing with the issue of poverty. Every individual and every community shares in promoting and preserving the common good. To be faithful to their ethical and religious vocation, communities of believers should take the lead in asking whether the human family has adequate means at its disposal to achieve the global common good. So I think that's a bit of a challenge to people like us in our communities, whether it's religious communities, civic communities, university communities. Are we asking the right questions about the means at the disposal of the human family to achieve a global common good? The leaders of the world in the year 2000 made an effort to do something for the greater good, for the common good. In the year 2000, the leaders of the world established the Millennium Declaration, in which they committed themselves to eradicate poverty by the year 2015. Their central challenge, they believed, was to ensure that globalization becomes a positive force for everyone through sustained efforts to create a shared future based upon our common humanity. The key objectives of the Millennium Declaration: peace and security and disarmament. And with that came a pledge to eliminate the dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. Development and poverty eradication, lifting humanity up from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty. Protecting our common environment, making sure that what we hand on to future generations has not been irredeemably spoilt by human activity. Human rights, democracy, and good governance, strengthening the rule of law, including human rights and the right to development. Protecting the vulnerable throughout the world, especially children and civilians, especially those who suffer disproportionately from armed conflict, from genocide and natural disasters. Meeting the special needs of Africa, which struggles mightily to lift itself out of poverty. And lastly, to strengthen the United Nations, that it might become a more effective instrument for achieving all of these ends. So the response that the leaders of the world offered were eightfold, and they were called the Millennium Development Goals. An effort to ensure that globalization becomes a positive force through sustained efforts to create a shared future based upon our common humanity. And they affirmed that the United Nations is the common house of the entire human family, and it's the place where these universal aspirations need to be dealt with. So I'm just going to walk you through the 8 Millennium Goals. This gives us a sense of the extent of poverty and all that it entails globally. And as we do this, remember what Thomas Berry said about both the natural and the human world, the natural and the human. We share one sacred community of life. There's one sacred community of life to which we all belong. So where does our common responsibility for one another come in? The first Millennium Development Goal is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to reduce the number of people living on less than $1 a day, to cut in half the number of those who suffer from hunger, to achieve full and productive employment. To date, there are 75 million young people who are unemployed. Young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. And it's unemployment among the young that's seeding so much of the unrest that's taking place in the Middle East today. There's widespread acknowledgement that the global economic crisis has taken a terrible toll, that it has increased the gap between the rich and the poor. When food and funds are scarce, patience and understanding are strained. Suicide, drug abuse, and violence against women and children are likely to increase. The second goal is to achieve universal primary education, because there is a belief that education is a key in both public health efforts and poverty eradication. Job prospects and income levels have the potential to rise. Both maternal and child health improves. Yet sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia continue to have the highest percentages of children not attending school. The third goal is to promote gender equality and to empower women worldwide. Girls between the ages of 5 and 14 are assuming ever greater roles within the household as caregivers. And much of this is happening in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia as a consequence of the epidemic of HIV/AIDS. I would just offer for your consideration a wonderful book entitled Half the Sky. It's written by Nicholas Kristof, who is a writer for the New York Times, and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dun, who is Chinese by birth. And in this book, they're both very committed to lifting up the plight of women and girls globally. It's a wonderful book to read. It's a difficult book to read, but it's very inspiring. It will give you a sense of what women and girls go through globally, some of whom don't make it, but many of whom do, and then commit their lives to trying to lift up the plight of women and girls right where they are. It's a very inspiring book, and I would heartily recommend it to you. The fourth goal, to reduce child mortality, to strengthen efforts against pneumonia, malaria, diarrhea, and AIDS. Together, these account for about 43% of children's deaths, children under the age of 5. Approximately 9 million children die each year before reaching the age of 5, and the highest rates are in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southern Asia. The fifth goal is to improve maternal health. A healthy mother, a relatively well-nourished mother, will give birth to a relatively healthy child, and isn't that the goal? But today, not just malnutrition among mothers, that's certainly one issue, but even more horrific, more than 350,000 women die each year from complications in pregnancy or childbirth. And 99% of those women come from the developing world. The greatest risk areas, once again, are sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, where most women go through in their entire period of pregnancy and the experience of childbirth without sterile, skilled care. Poverty and a lack of education continue to perpetuate high adolescent birth rates. It's a proven fact that if girls and women are educated, they will marry later and more than likely have fewer children. On the other hand, when we look at developing world and we see many pregnancies, we need to understand what drives those pregnancies. People need the security of knowing they have children to take care of them. So a woman could be pregnant 12 times and have 4 or 5 living children. So there's a deep drive to make sure that there's some kind of security for parents as they age. And once again, in the book Half the Sky, this issue of maternal health is covered quite well. The 6th goal has to do with combating HIV, AIDS, and other disease, particularly malaria. I don't think we ever hear of anybody in the United States dying of malaria, maybe once in a very blue moon. But in the developing world, malaria kills a child every 45 seconds. When I speak with high school students, one of the things I mention to them is a campaign called Nothing But Nets. I don't know if any of you here are familiar with that. But a writer for Sports Illustrated apparently visited a country in Africa and was horrified at what he saw in terms of the deaths attributed to malaria among children primarily, but also the adult population. So when he came home, he started this campaign, Nothing But Nets. You can Google it. $10 buys a mosquito net, and that in some instances that's all that it takes. Protection at night from mosquitoes. So malaria is not only curable, it's preventable. But yet it takes a terrible toll on lives in the developing world. Another reality in the developing world today is what non-communicable diseases, which is described as slow motion disaster. More and more people are dying of diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer. Cigarettes aren't the mode anymore in this country, so you know where the cigarettes go. Even sugar products are becoming more and more not the thing to do in our country because so many children are obese. So where do those sugar products go? Many times to the developing world. So these non-communicable diseases are also of great concern. The 7th goal has to do with our environment, environmental sustainability, an effort to reduce biodiversity loss, an effort to make sure that more and more people have clean drinking water, an effort to curb species extinction, which is happening even as we speak. And in the way development has been done in our country, in other Western countries, the economy was always pivotal. The economy was what was important. Profit was what was important. And there was very little concern about what that economic drive did to people or to the environment. So there's a move to really shift the thinking that if we're going to move forward with economic development, which we need to do and which the developing world needs to do, it can't be done in exactly the same way that we've done it here. It has to be done in a way that is much more respectful of Earth as a living organism. It has to be done in a way that works to preserve the integrity of Earth, even as it builds up people and lifts them from poverty. And this is a very tough nut to deal with, because it requires a transfer of money into research and development that's going to wean us away from a development model that we have become very accustomed to. The last Millennium Development Goal calls upon the international community to develop a partnership between the developed world and the developing countries to make sure that trade and financial system is open and transparent, to address the needs of least developed countries, especially regarding tariffs, debt relief. So many countries should be forgiven debt rather than expected to pay back with interest. And of course, a need for more generous aid and a need to be able to track how, in fact, that aid is used, which holds the recipient to an accountability. The need to partner to develop work especially for youth, and to increase access to drugs and medications that would help to cure and indeed prevent diseases that are both curable and preventable. So the target date for the Millennium Development Goals was the year 2015. Now, in the interim, in 2008-2009, we had a global financial and economic crisis. And many donor nations began to cut back on aid. One thing that they did not cut back on, and we'll talk about this a little further on down the line, is military budgets. In the height of the crisis, donor aid was cut back and military budgets continued to escalate. The poverty that is exemplified in the 8 Millennium Development Goals is also present here in the United States. It might not be so glaring, it's much more hidden, but not too long ago there was a PBS special, and perhaps some of you saw it. And the PBS special indicated that in our own country there are 46 million people living in poverty. 2.5 million driven into poverty as a result of the global financial and economic crisis. And one of the greatest drivers in terms of poverty in the United States is, in fact, unemployment. So again, as Dominicans, we have 3 overarching themes that we deal with: peace and security, migration, economic justice, and care of creation. So everything that we do at the UN to advocate in some way falls under these umbrellas. And the work that we do is also informed by the principles of Catholic social teaching. And one of the principles of Catholic social teaching really has to do with that notion of solidarity. Being in solidarity, a firm and purposeful commitment, as John Paul said, to work for the common good, the greater good. Nelson Mandela said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It's a human creation, and it can be eradicated and overcome by the actions of human beings, people like you and me. But, you know, Albert Einstein had a great adage. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this. Albert Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem using the same level of consciousness that created the problem to begin with. So what we're really invited to is a whole other way of thinking, and to think and act out of a deeper level of consciousness that really does connect us in solidarity with people worldwide. So poverty persists like a plague, but it's not inevitable. The truth is, it's frequently the result of the actions and the omissions of those who are in charge of policy and influential actors who have great influence over how policies are created, such as multinational corporations and the international financial industry. Benedict XVI has said that every economic decision has a moral consequence. And that doesn't just mean in global affairs. Just think of our own purchasing power. The way we use our purchasing power, that's an economic decision that has a moral consequence. Perhaps some of you are aware of fair trade coffee, tea, chocolate. A decision to buy fair trade has a moral consequence. You're lifting up the lives of local people who do the work and eliminating the middleman who so often minimizes what the people at the base actually receive. So every economic decision carries with it a moral consequence. What I'd like to do is just briefly address 3 of the systems that I think clearly underpin the phenomena of poverty in our world today. First of all, the way we have done development, it's profit-centered. It equates progress exclusively with economic growth. But what many people are realizing, not everybody, but what many people are realizing more and more is that there are limits to economic growth because there are in fact limits to the resources on the planet. Profit-centered development doesn't factor in people, it doesn't factor in the integrity of the earth. The current global financial architecture, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and just the way finance is done globally in general, it's not done in a way that favors people living in poverty. There's lack of effective oversight in international financial transactions, and ultimately that's what led to the meltdown in 2008-2009. And finally, the issue of military spending. The disproportionate amount of resources, both financial and otherwise, poured into military budgets, the refinement of weapons, and training for war. And though in some way they might seem like very distinct realities, the truth is they're interconnected and they feed one into the other. Just going to highlight military spending and remind us of some of what has been said in the past. The Council Fathers at the Second Vatican Council said the arms race is an utterly treacherous trap for humanity. It ensnares the poor to an intolerable degree. And Paul VI reminds us that when we combat misery and struggle against injustice, we're not just providing for the prosperity of people, but we're also doing something in terms of humanity's spiritual and moral development. So when we care for one another, when we lift one another up, there's a moral issue there. There is indeed a moral imperative to do that. And peace is not just about eliminating weapons, but it's working towards a more perfect justice that's demanded of men and of women, people like you and me. And Pope Paul VI actually said in 67-68 that development is another word for peace, that we will never have peace unless people are provided what they need to lift themselves out of abject poverty and enjoy something of fullness of life here and now. Paul VI also suggested in 1967 that a portion of global military budgets be set aside and placed in a global humanitarian development fund. Now, could you imagine what the world might be like today if people had listened to that? So I think the truth is the war on terror has offered a whole new set of justifications for countries to increase arsenals, just at a time when there's tremendous pressure being brought to bear on countries to accelerate their progress to achieve the Millennium Development Goals and work to both mitigate and adapt to the reality of climate change. I think it's important for us to realize that we frequently don't only deal with the phenomenon of global terrorism through military activity. We don't spend as much time or energy trying to really explore what the root causes of terrorism are. For instance, the desire on the part of the West to ensure that we have control over oil and gas resources in the Middle East, and the widespread and enduring poverty and massive unemployment that's the downside of the globalization that we enjoy. Globalization has worked for us, but in many instances it's done so on the backs of peoples in the developing world. For them, globalization has meant oppression, exploitation, the burden of climate change, and ongoing conflict. So governments need to recognize and wake up. They need to recognize that excessive military budgets not only render all of us less secure, but they hold hostage an important set of resources that could be contributing to the eradication of poverty worldwide and a much more secure and peaceful world for all of us. Militarism and the economic framework that supports it are probably the largest barriers to eradicating poverty today. They destroy communities, waste resources, pollute air and water, prevent sustainable development, and siphon off resources that could be put at the service of human needs and the cause of a genuine and lasting peace. The United States is the largest military spender, spending 43% of the global total, 6 times that of our nearest rival, which is China. The budget for 2 B-52 bombers is more than the annual budget for the World Food Program. In 2009 alone, which was in the midst of the global financial and economic crisis, military expenditures rose to $1,536 billion, and official donor assistance reached $126 billion. And many nations said they had to cut back on that donor assistance because of the crisis. But military budgets continued to increase. Go back to that image of the gun and the twisted barrel. It's twisted priorities. The estimated annual investment to meet the Millennium Development Goals is approximately $330 billion, which is about 20% of global military spending. This information is provided by the American Friends Service Committee. It's just a breakdown on how the federal government spent the income tax dollar in 2010. 39% of the income tax dollar went to the Pentagon budget, nuclear weapons, military-related programs, Veterans Affairs. Drop down to the bottom figure, 2% went into diplomacy, development, prevention of war, and aid for international development. So we continue to fund war and its aftermath to a much higher degree than we fund development globally. Martin Luther King said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." And if you remember, Paul VI said that, when we're working to combat misery, we're not just alleviating poverty, we're doing something to the moral fabric of humanity as well. Very, very important. Jesus says in the gospel, "I've come that they may have life and have it to the full." Did he mean that just for the people here in the U.S.? Yeah. What did he mean? And how do we read something like that against the backdrop of the reality of our world today? The Second Vatican Council in the Church in the Modern World had a very beautiful statement. "The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the peoples of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these too are the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ, of any people of goodwill, regardless of what one's faith tradition is." Last September, Archbishop Dolan, soon to be Cardinal, wrote a letter to the bishops in the United States. And he asked them to lift up the issue of poverty right here, to do whatever they could do as pastors, as preachers, as teachers, to lift up this terrible issue of poverty. He said, 46 million people living in poverty. These numbers bring home to us the human costs and moral consequences of a broken economy. The common good will not advance. Economic security will not be achieved when so many people live without the dignity of work and bear the crushing burden of poverty. All must work together, he said, to find ways to promote the common good in national and economic life. I just wonder if any of us have heard this preached about on a Sunday morning. So, it's often been said that when people become outraged, it's often been said that when conditions become outrageous, people become outraged. There's a marvelous book entitled The Silent Cry by the late German liberation theologian Dorothy Soleil. And she writes a section on Cesar Chavez. Now, some of you know who Cesar Chavez was. Maybe some of you don't. Cesar Chavez was back in the 60s. He was a labor leader, a farm worker, and he co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers. And she wrote this of Cesar Chavez. She said, he was a practicing Roman Catholic who prepared himself carefully for every action through prayer and fasting. Every time he would prepare himself, his enemies would say, "Watch out, Cesar Chavez is up to something. He's praying." During the summer of 1968, Cesar Chavez maintained a fast for life that lasted 36 days in protest against the pesticide poisoning of vineyard workers and their children. And he said at that time, and I quote, "If you are outraged about existing conditions, you cannot be free or happy until you give all your time to change them and do nothing else but that." If you are outraged about existing conditions, you cannot be free or happy because you know the people who are living in those outrageous conditions are in some way an extension of yourself. So maybe a question we need to ask ourselves as we grapple with the reality of our world today is very simply, are we outraged about the existing conditions in our world? And if we're not, why not? If we are outraged, what actions are we willing to take? What questions are we willing to ask? Or do we have so much invested in the way things are that silence and inaction seem the better course for us to take? In speaking about a biblically inspired option for the poor, an Irish theologian by the name of Donald Dorr speaks of two important aspects. Solidarity, which means what am I willing to do to enter into the reality of the poor and the marginalized? And the second aspect, he says, is political. It begins with the discernment and analysis of a situation, and it leads to a choice to ensure that we are not consciously or unconsciously colluding in the injustice. Perhaps the story of Bartolomé de las Casas offers us an insight in this regard. His own status as a slave owner, as a participant in the system of forced slavery and forced labor, was deeply challenged by the preaching of Montesinos. While it took Las Casas several more years and additional witnessing of the abuses and the atrocities of the system of forced labor, of which he was a part, he ultimately experienced a profound inner conversion, which was nothing short of an acknowledgement of his own collusion in the injustice. Our stories will never be as dramatic as the story of Las Casas. But nonetheless, I think our participation in our own ongoing process of conversion is absolutely essential, and it may even be our primary role as we struggle to respond to the injustices of our day in terms of poverty. This morning, I spoke with 2 classes, and Ron Karsten was present, and he used this great expression. He said, we need to blush. We in this country who have so much, we need to blush once in a while. Be willing to do that, you know, to feel the burden, in a sense, of the goodness, the good life that is ours, and maybe even to be a little embarrassed by it. There's nothing wrong with that. Because at the end of the day, it could impel us to profound action, to ask profound questions, right where we are, in the different venues within which we mingle, you know. So our role is not necessarily something grand and glorious, but it's being attentive to our own struggle, our own ongoing struggle of conversion, an acknowledgement that in some way we're all part of the problem, but we're all part of the solution. And I want to conclude just by going back to what the Pontifical Council said, because I think this speaks to all of us in some way. Every individual and every community shares in promoting and preserving the common good. To be faithful to ethical and religious vocations, communities of believers like us should take the lead in asking whether the human family has adequate means at its disposal to achieve a global common good. We need to ask ourselves that. We need to ask one another that. We need to ask our congresspeople that. We need to keep the conversation going. So I'm going to ask you to just sit for a moment. Just sit for a moment.